December 1900. The North Atlantic moves in long, heavy swells against the black cliffs of the Flannan Isles, a remote cluster of jagged rock formations nearly 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. Winter settles hard in this part of the world. The wind carries salt and isolation in equal measure. On the tallest rock of Eilean Mor stands the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, a white tower built to defy the sea's indifference. On the evening of December 15th, 1900, something unusual happens. Ships passing through the Minch note that the lighthouse light, normally a reliable guardian in darkness, is not visible. At first it is assumed to be weather. Storms are common here. But as hours pass and no beam cuts through the night, concern begins to grow. By the 26th of December, the relief vessel Hesperus sets course for Eilean Mor to investigate. The lighthouse had only been operational since 1899. It was designed to protect vessels from the dangerous reefs that had claimed countless ships. 3 men were assigned to maintain it: Principal Keeper James Ducat, Second Assistant Thomas Marshall, and Occasional Keeper Donald McArthur. All were experienced. All understood the sea. James Ducat was 43 years old, a steady and disciplined man. He had a wife and children on the mainland. His record showed competence and reliability. Thomas Marshall, younger but equally seasoned, was known to be methodical. Donald McArthur was the temporary replacement for the regular third keeper. Unlike the others, he had a reputation on land for a temper, but at sea and on duty, he was described as capable. The system was simple. 3 men stationed at the lighthouse while 1 remained ashore on rotation. Their work was demanding but predictable: maintain the light, record the weather, monitor supplies, follow routine. Isolation was expected. Silence was part of the job. When the Hesperus approaches Eilean Mor on December 26th, Captain James Harvey notices immediately that something is wrong. There is no flag at the mast, no signal, no figure waiting at the landing stage. Relief days were significant events. The arriving crew would normally be greeted. The sea is too rough to land immediately. It takes several hours before conditions allowed Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, to climb the steep path toward the lighthouse. He later describes an unsettling stillness. No sound of machinery, no human presence. Only wind. The main entrance door is closed. Inside, everything appears orderly. The kitchen table holds plates of uneaten food. A chair is overturned. One of the clocks has stopped. Oilskins, heavy waterproof coats essential for going outside in winter, are missing for 2 of the men. A third remains hanging on its peg. The beds are unmade, as though the day had begun normally. The lamp room above is clean. The light itself has been extinguished and maintained properly before going dark. There is no sign of struggle. No blood, no obvious damage inside the structure. Joseph Moore returns to the Hesperus visibly shaken. A full search of the island is conducted. The cliffs are steep and unforgiving. The western landing shows signs of storm damage. A storage box used for mooring ropes is smashed. Iron railings are bent, but there are no bottas. No clear indication of where the men went. At this point, the first major revelation becomes clear. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers have vanished from a locked and orderly station on a remote island with no witnesses. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. An official inquiry begins under the Northern Lighthouse Board. Superintendent Robert Muirhead, who had personally selected the men, travels to the island. He examines the logbook. The entries raise questions. On December 12th, Marshall records severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen. Ducat is described as unusually quiet. McArthur is noted to have been crying. On December 13th, the log mentions that the storm continues and that all 3 men are praying. The final entry, dated December 15th, reads, "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all." Meteorological reports from the mainland, however, do not confirm any significant storm activity on those dates. Weather logs suggest conditions were rough, but not extraordinary. The discrepancy fuels speculation. Why would seasoned keepers be so shaken by weather that official records did not acknowledge? Why would McArthur, known as a hardened individual, be described as weeping? Investigators consider several possibilities. The first theory suggests a rogue wave. The western landing area shows clear signs of heavy wave impact. Perhaps two men went down to secure equipment during rough seas. A sudden surge could have swept them away. The third keeper, seeing this, may have rushed out without properly securing himself. This would explain the missing oilskins. It would also explain why one set remained inside, suggesting one man left in haste. But protocol dictated that at least one keeper must remain inside at all times to maintain the light. Would all three have abandoned their posts simultaneously? Another theory considers internal conflict. Three men isolated in harsh conditions. Tension builds, an argument escalates, violence follows. But there is no evidence of struggle inside. No blood, no damage suggesting confrontation. A third possibility involves the geography itself. The cliffs of Eilean Moor drop sharply into the Atlantic. A single misstep could mean death. If one man slipped, the others might have attempted a rescue. The sea, powerful and indifferent, would leave little trace. Superintendent Muirhead ultimately concludes that the men were likely swept away while attempting to secure equipment during an unexpected wave. The official report states that they were blown away by a great wave. Yet certain details remain unresolved. Why were the log entries so emotionally charged? Why describe prayer among experienced seamen accustomed to storms? Why did the final entry suggest calm seas if a fatal wave occurred afterward? And what of the stopped clock and the uneaten meal? Did something interrupt them suddenly? Or was the appearance misleading, distorted by the passage of days before discovery? In the years that followed, folklore filled the silence left by facts. Stories of sea monsters, foreign spies, and supernatural forces attached themselves to the Flannan Isles, but no physical evidence supports those claims. The most grounded explanation remains the sea itself. The Atlantic does not need witnesses. Rogue waves, known to reach extreme heights without warning, have been documented in similar regions. A sudden surge against unstable footing on wet rock could erase three men within seconds. Still, the case leaves a particular kind of absence. No bodies were ever recovered, no personal items washed ashore. Families were left without closure. Today, the lighthouse stands automated. The keepers are gone. The island remains quiet except for seabirds and wind. The beam that once required human vigilance now turns mechanically. In December 1900, three men walked into the routine of another winter shift. Somewhere between a log entry and a cold Atlantic swell, they disappeared. There were no distress signals. No final words beyond ink on paper. Only a silent tower, a calm sea that official records insisted was ordinary, and a mystery that endures not because of spectacle, but because of its restraint. The lighthouse that went silent did not collapse. It did not burn. It simply continued standing after the men inside it were no longer there.
In the weeks following the official report, the island was not immediately abandoned. Relief keepers resumed rotation at the Flannan Isles lighthouse, stepping into a space that still carried the weight of unanswered questions. The beds were remade. The kitchen table was cleared. The clock was reset. Routine returned, at least on paper. But among lighthouse crews and seamen along the Scottish coast, the disappearance did not settle into a simple explanation. The Northern Lighthouse Board maintained its position. Superintendent Robert Muirhead stood by the conclusion that an unexpected wave had taken the men. He emphasized the damaged equipment at the western landing, the twisted iron railings, the displaced supply box weighing over a ton, and the rope strewn along the rocks. These were not minor disturbances. They indicated force, considerable force. Yet some details refused to align neatly. For one, lighthouse procedure was strict. One keeper was always to remain inside the tower while the others worked outside. The light could not be neglected. It was a navigational lifeline for passing vessels. If two men had descended to the landing stage to secure equipment during heavy seas, the third should have remained in the tower. The missing oilskins complicate the picture. Two sets were gone. One remained hanging inside. This suggests that two men prepared for outdoor work. The third, possibly MacArthur, may have rushed out later without his coat, either in alarm or in response to a shout. That scenario carries a sense of urgency, something sudden enough to override protocol, something that convinced a man to leave the safety of the tower in winter conditions without protective gear. Investigators also reviewed the timing of events. The final log entry was dated December 15th. The light was reported not functioning on the night of December 15th by the passing steamer Archtor. However, due to weather and schedule, that report did not reach shore authorities immediately. By the time the Hesperus was dispatched, days had passed. This delay introduces uncertainty. The exact moment the light failed is not precisely known. It may have gone dark earlier than assumed. Meteorological records from the Isle of Lewis and nearby coastal stations were re-examined. While no catastrophic storm was officially recorded between December 12th and 15th, weather patterns in the North Atlantic can vary significantly across short distances. The Flannan Isles sit exposed, without natural shelter. A localized squall, intensified by Atlantic pressure systems, may not have registered with mainland observers. There is also the matter of the log entries themselves. Thomas Marshall's handwriting on December 12th describes winds, the likes of which I have never seen. For an experienced seaman to write such a line suggests either extraordinary conditions or heightened perception. The entry noting that MacArthur was crying stands out sharply. Donald McArthur had once been fined for a physical altercation on land. He was not generally described as fragile. Some historians argue that these log entries may have been misinterpreted. The phrasing could reflect standard maritime caution rather than panic. The term praying may have been routine language rather than literal fear. Religious expression was common among seafarers in moments of difficulty. But even allowing for linguistic context, the emotional tone appears stronger than expected. Another question arises regarding the stopped clock. When Joseph Moore entered the kitchen, one clock had ceased functioning. Some suggest this detail is symbolic rather than evidential. Mechanical clocks of that era required regular winding. If the men were gone for several days before discovery, it would naturally stop. Its presence in reports may have amplified the mystery, even if it holds little investigative value. The overturned chair, however, remains ambiguous. It could indicate haste, or it could be a minor detail misremembered or displaced during initial discovery. What investigators did not find may be as important as what they did. There were no signs of prolonged absence before the event, no packed belongings, no written farewell, no missing provisions suggesting escape. The supply inventory was intact. Personal items remained inside. This reduces the likelihood of voluntary departure. There was nowhere practical to go. The island offers no shelter beyond the lighthouse structures. The nearest inhabited land lies miles across open sea. Without a boat, departure would have been impossible. No unauthorized vessel was reported in the vicinity during that period. The remoteness of Isle Moor makes clandestine arrival unlikely without detection by passing ships. Over time, alternative theories gained traction outside official channels. Some speculated that a dispute escalated into violence and that bodies were disposed of at sea. Yet 3 men vanishing without trace in such a manner would require coordination or accident. And again, no physical evidence supports internal conflict. Others suggested a natural phenomenon known today as a rogue wave. In 1900, the concept was not well understood. Modern oceanography confirms that waves of extreme height can form suddenly due to wave interference and underwater topography. The western landing of Isle Moor faces directly into prevailing Atlantic swells. A wave exceeding expectations could have surged higher than the men anticipated, overtopping the platform and sweeping all three away. If two were already on the rocks and the third ran down to assist, they could have been caught together. This explanation aligns with the damaged mooring box and bent ironwork. It also accounts for the absence of bodies. The Atlantic in winter is efficient at concealment. Still, there remains a psychological element that continues to unsettle observers more than a century later. The image of three competent, experienced men, maintaining routine, writing in a logbook, preparing a meal, and then gone. No final distress flare, no wreckage, no survivor. In the years after 1900, lighthouse service continued to evolve. Automation gradually reduced the need for isolated crews. By 1971, the Flannan Isles lighthouse was fully automated, eliminating the human presence that once defined it. Today, visitors rarely set foot on Isle Moor. The island is primarily a site for seabird populations and occasional maintenance crews. The tower still stands, white against dark rock, its beam rotating without pause. There are no graves for Ducat, Marshall, or MacArthur. Their names appear in records and maritime histories, but their final moments remain speculative. The official conclusion, swept away by an unexpected wave, remains the most probable. It requires no conspiracy, no supernatural force, only weather, rock, and timing. Yet the case endures because it highlights the fragile boundary between routine and catastrophe. Three men performing ordinary duties in an extraordinary environment. A single miscalculation or a single wave could erase them. The lighthouse that went silent did not announce tragedy with spectacle. It offered only absence. And sometimes, in investigations like this, absence is the most difficult evidence to reconcile. As the 20th century progressed, the disappearance at Isle Moor shifted from an active investigation into a maritime anomaly filed within institutional memory. But among those who worked in lighthouses, it never fully settled into routine history. The event became a quiet reference point, a reminder spoken in measured tones during long nights when wind pressed hard against stone. To understand why the case continues to resist closure, it helps to reconstruct, as precisely as possible, the final known hours before silence. On December 15th, sometime before dusk, the keepers would have begun preparations for lighting the lamp. The process was technical and deliberate. The lens apparatus, a Fresnel system designed to magnify and project light across miles of ocean, required maintenance. Fuel levels were checked. Mechanisms were cleaned. Timing was exact. Ships depended on consistency. There is no evidence the lamp malfunctioned mechanically. When the relief party inspected it on December 26th, it was found in working order. The wicks had been trimmed. The reservoir was not empty. This suggests that the light was extinguished not by technical failure but by absence. If the men left the tower before nightfall, something must have drawn them outside with urgency. Investigators revisited the western landing area in detail. The Flannan Isles had two principal landing points. The east landing, generally safer and used during calmer conditions, and the west landing, exposed directly to Atlantic swells. The damage was concentrated at the west. The supply crane positioned above the landing was used to hoist provisions from boats below. A large wooden box, normally secured well above high water mark, had been displaced. Iron staples embedded deep into rock had been torn free. This indicated repeated or sustained wave action rather than a single splash. Modern analysis of wave behavior in the North Atlantic has shown that certain geological formations can amplify wave height through refraction and rebound. Isle Moor's cliffs create angular surfaces that reflect energy back into incoming swells. Under particular conditions, this can result in chaotic wave interference, producing walls of water significantly higher than surrounding seas. Such a phenomenon might not register as a conventional storm, In mainland weather logs, localized intensity can exist without broader atmospheric markers. If Marshall and Ducat descended to secure the crane equipment during heavy surf, they may have underestimated the risk. It is plausible they believed the worst had passed. The final log entry stating "sea calm" could reflect a deceptive lull, an interval between larger sets of waves. Ocean swells often arrive in patterns. After several moderate waves, a larger rogue set can follow unexpectedly. Experienced sailors know this risk, but familiarity can also breed confidence. Donald McArthur's absence of oilskins becomes significant here. If he initially remained in the tower while the other two worked outside, he may have seen a wave strike. He may have heard shouting. His decision to leave without protective gear suggests immediacy. In winter conditions, no keeper would willingly expose himself without oilskins unless seconds mattered. The cliff edges near the western landing offer little margin. Wet stone becomes nearly frictionless. A surge powerful enough to dislodge iron fixtures could sweep men into open water instantly. In December, sea temperatures around the outer Hebrides average near 8 degrees Celsius. Survival time in such conditions without flotation is measured in minutes. Once in the water, strong currents move swiftly westward into deep Atlantic channels. Recovery would be unlikely. Even if bodies surfaced later, they might drift far from initial coordinates. Despite this plausible sequence, investigators at the time faced limitations. There were no photographic records of the damage before cleanup, no forensic oceanography. The assessment relied on observation and deduction. Rumors began almost immediately among mainland communities. Some fishermen claimed that the men may have been taken by a foreign vessel, perhaps in a dispute or accident. However, shipping logs from vessels in the area during that period show no unusual encounters. The sea lanes were monitored, and no distress signals were reported. Another suggestion pointed to the possibility of a cliff collapse. The geology of the Flannans includes unstable rock faces subject to erosion. A sudden breakaway could have carried men into the sea. Yet subsequent inspections did not reveal fresh, large-scale rockfall matching that timeline. Then there are the log entries again, perhaps the most psychologically enduring element. The December 12th notation about unprecedented winds stands in contrast to official weather summaries. Some researchers have suggested that the entry may not have referred solely to wind speed, but to wave behavior or sound. Wind against rock can produce resonance. In confined stone structures, this can amplify perception of intensity. The remark that McArthur was crying may indicate tension rather than terror. Isolation affects individuals differently. 3 men confined for weeks in a harsh environment may experience fluctuating morale. December darkness in the outer Hebrides allows for less than 6 hours of daylight. Extended isolation under such conditions can heighten emotional responses. The line stating that all 3 men were praying has been interpreted by some as evidence of fear. Yet religious observance was not uncommon in lighthouse service. Daily prayer or scripture reading could have been routine. Still, the finality of the December 15th entry carries weight. God is over all. It reads less like a weather note and more like a closing statement. Whether that impression is shaped by hindsight remains uncertain. Superintendent Muirhead, conscious of public concern, emphasized rational explanation. In his official communication, he avoided speculation. He framed the event within occupational hazard. His language was restrained. There was no attempt to dramatize. For the families of Ducat, Marshall, and McArthur, the absence created a prolonged grief without resolution. Financial compensation was provided under lighthouse service provisions, but emotional closure remained elusive. There were no remains to bury, no definitive account to recount. Over time, literary treatments introduced embellishment. Poets and writers added supernatural elements, strange lights, unknown ships, spectral forces. These additions, while compelling, have no basis in contemporary records. They reflect human discomfort with incomplete narratives. What persists in documented evidence is this: 3 trained professionals vanished within a narrow time frame. Physical damage at the landing indicates severe sea action. No signs of voluntary departure exist. No external intrusion is recorded. In modern terms, the event aligns with accidental loss due to environmental hazard. Yet the psychological resonance remains because the setting itself embodies isolation. A lighthouse is designed as a symbol of constancy. Its failure, even temporary, suggests vulnerability in systems meant to protect. The automation of the Flannan Isles lighthouse in 1971 removed the human variable entirely. Today, maintenance visits are brief and scheduled. Weather data is monitored remotely. No keeper spends months listening to wind in solitude. If the same environmental conditions occurred now, there would be no one on the rocks securing crates by hand. No one stepping beyond protocol in a moment of urgency. The silence that followed December 15, 1900, was not immediate in public awareness. It unfolded slowly, discovered through absence rather than alarm. Perhaps that is why it endures. There was no single dramatic moment recorded, only a sequence inferred. In reconstructing the likely scenario, the simplest explanation remains the strongest: a dangerous sea, underestimated timing, and a chain reaction of human response. 2 men attempt to secure equipment during heavy surf. A sudden, amplified wave strikes with greater force than anticipated. Both are swept away. The third, witnessing or hearing the event, abandons safety to assist. He too is taken. Within minutes, the tower stands empty. The lamp, unlit, becomes the first silent witness. No conspiracy is required. No unseen vessel. Only the Atlantic in winter, operating within its own physics. And yet, more than a century later, the question lingers not because the sea is mysterious, but because the men were methodical. They were not reckless adventurers. They were civil servants of maritime safety. The lighthouse that went silent represents the intersection of human routine and natural unpredictability. It remains one of the most restrained mysteries on record, defined not by spectacle, but by the quiet persistence of unanswered space where 3 lives once continued their daily log entries. The pages end. The tower remains. The sea continues its rhythm, indifferent to whether anyone stands watch. By the early months of 1901, the formal inquiries into the disappearance at the Flannan Isles lighthouse had concluded, but administrative closure did not erase operational unease. The Northern Lighthouse authorities quietly reviewed procedural standards for remote stations. Though no sweeping reforms were publicly announced, internal emphasis on strict adherence to the one man remains inside rule was reinforced across the network of lights surrounding the Scottish coast. The island itself, Eilean Moor, returned to its natural rhythm. Seabirds nested along the cliffs. Wind carved its familiar paths along the rock faces. The tower resumed function with a new rotation of keepers, men who arrived aware of what had occurred but bound by profession to maintain composure. For them, the task was practical: tend the light, record the weather, maintain equipment. Yet human psychology does not reset as easily as machinery. Several keepers later reported that their first nights on the island carried a heightened awareness of sound. The Atlantic, when striking the western cliffs, produces deep concussive echoes that travel through stone. Doors tremble slightly within their frames. Metal fittings hum. In isolation, such noises magnify in significance. None of these reports suggested supernatural belief. Instead, they revealed how environment shapes perception. In reviewing surviving correspondence from lighthouse staff of the era, one observes a pattern of guarded language. The disappearance was rarely described in detail. It was referred to simply as the accident or the loss. Professional culture within the lighthouse service valued steadiness. speculation was discouraged. Yet outside official channels, maritime communities along the coast of the Isle of Lewis continued to discuss inconsistencies. Fishermen understood localized weather better than distant observers. Some insisted that Atlantic squalls could rise without warning beyond the view of mainland stations. They pointed out that ocean swells travel thousands of miles from distant storms. A system forming far west in the Atlantic might send powerful wave sets toward exposed islands, even if local seas appeared stable. This insight aligns with modern meteorology. Swell energy generated by remote low-pressure systems can propagate long distances, arriving as powerful, regular waves independent of local wind. To an observer standing on a cliff, the sea might appear manageable, until a larger, delayed set arrives with amplified force. Such a mechanism would explain the logbook contradiction. Marshall's notation of extraordinary wind may have reflected wave impact rather than sustained gale conditions. The sea striking the western face could have produced vertical spray and concussion sufficient to alarm even experienced men. When Superintendent Muirhead of the Northern Lighthouse Board finalized his report, he avoided dramatizing these nuances. His responsibility was to deliver a plausible, evidence-based conclusion. The phrase, "blown away by a great wave," summarized complex ocean behavior in accessible terms. It also preserved institutional confidence. To suggest deeper uncertainty might have undermined trust in lighthouse operations. There remains, however, a narrow window of reconstructed time that investigators could never fully close. If the final entry on December 15th was written during daylight, and if the light failed to appear that evening, then the disappearance likely occurred between late afternoon and nightfall. In December at that latitude, darkness descends quickly. Twilight lingers briefly before full night overtakes the sea. Imagine the sequence in practical terms. Two men descend toward the western landing to secure the supply box and check moorings after observing repeated wave strikes. The third remains inside, perhaps cleaning lamp glass or reviewing fuel levels. A surge greater than anticipated overtops the rock platform. One or both men lose footing. A shout carries upward against wind. Inside the tower, the remaining keeper hears something irregular, an impact, perhaps a cry. He moves toward the doorway, sees empty rock where colleagues had stood moments earlier. Without full consideration, he rushes down. From that point forward, the sea requires only seconds. Cold water shock alone can incapacitate within moments. Strong lateral currents along cliff bases create turbulence that prevents effective swimming. Heavy wool uniforms and boots add weight. Even if one man briefly surfaced, another wave could submerge him immediately. The absence of bodies, often cited as mysterious, is consistent with winter Atlantic conditions. Decomposition gases that cause bodies to resurface develop more slowly in cold water. Marine scavengers and deep currents further reduce recovery likelihood. In 1900, organized maritime search capability was limited. Once days passed, probability of retrieval diminished sharply. Despite this, the emotional component persists because of the domestic scene left behind. Plates on the table, beds partially arranged, a clock unwound. These details humanize the event. They freeze routine at the moment before disruption. They also reflect how quickly normalcy can collapse under environmental force. Over the decades, literary retellings have introduced embellishments. Strange ships on the horizon, unexplained footprints, coded log entries. None appear in primary records. The relief keeper, Joseph Moore, described the station as orderly. There were no additional sets of footprints leading away from the island. No damaged door locks. No missing lifeboat. The absence of forced entry eliminates the possibility of external abduction without extraordinary circumstance. The island's geography offers no hidden coves large enough for stealth landing without visible disturbance. Another angle occasionally raised concerns psychological breakdown induced by isolation. Lighthouse duty in remote posts could last weeks without contact. Winter darkness compounds monotony. However, psychological collapse severe enough to lead to mutual destruction would likely leave physical evidence inside the tower. No such evidence was found. In modern assessments, oceanographers have revisited the site using contemporary modeling. Studies of wave refraction around irregular coastlines confirm that wave heights at the western landing could exceed open water averages significantly. Rock geometry can concentrate energy at specific impact points. This supports the official explanation without requiring exceptional storm classification. The disappearance at the Flannan Isles thus represents a case where environmental science eventually caught up to early intuition. What appeared extraordinary in 1900 may now be understood within natural parameters. Yet understanding mechanism does not erase impact. For the families of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur, the event did not resolve into data. It remained an absence at the table during winter evenings. Lighthouse service was both livelihood and risk. Compensation payments acknowledged duty. They did not provide certainty. Today, automation ensures that no keeper stands alone on that cliff in winter darkness. The beam rotates without fatigue. Weather data transmits digitally. Ships navigate with satellite systems unimaginable in 1900. And still the tower stands as it did then, white against black rock, exposed to the same Atlantic swells.
The disappearance at the Flannan Isles thus represents a case where environmental science eventually caught up to early intuition. What appeared extraordinary in 1900 may now be understood within natural parameters, yet understanding mechanism does not erase impact. For the families of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur, the event did not resolve into data. It remained an absence at the table during winter evenings. Lighthouse service was both livelihood and risk. Compensation payments acknowledged duty. They did not provide certainty. Today, automation ensures that no keeper stands alone on that cliff in winter darkness. The beam rotates without fatigue. Weather data transmits digitally. Ships navigate with satellite systems unimaginable in 1900. And still, the tower stands as it did then, white against black rock, exposed to the same Atlantic swells. The lighthouse that went silent did not leave behind dramatic wreckage or cryptic final messages. It left a narrow corridor of probability framed by physical evidence and environmental context. 3 men performed routine tasks. A natural force exceeded expectation. The sequence unfolded too quickly for correction. In investigative terms, the case demonstrates how minimal evidence can still yield rational conclusion. In human terms, it demonstrates how even rational conclusions leave room for lingering reflection. And somewhere within that rhythm lies the final, unrecorded moment when the watch ended and the tower was left alone. As the 20th century drew toward its midpoint, the disappearance at Alien Moor gradually shifted from living memory into documented legacy. Those who had personally known James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur passed on. What remained were records, logbooks, official correspondence, service rosters, and the persistent awareness that 3 trained lighthouse keepers had vanished in the execution of routine duty. Historical re-examination of the case intensified in the latter half of the century as maritime historians gained greater access to archival materials. When original documents from the Northern Lighthouse Board were reviewed in detail, a striking consistency appeared. There was no indication of administrative doubt. The conclusion that the men were swept away while attempting to secure equipment was presented as reasoned, not speculative. There were no hidden memoranda suggesting alternative explanations suppressed from public view. This is significant. In many historical mysteries, later research uncovers contradictory testimony or overlooked witness accounts. In the Flannan Isles case, no such contradictions surfaced in official archives. The narrative remained internally consistent. However, absence of contradiction does not equate to presence of certainty. The surviving logbook entries, sparse as they are, became the focal point of repeated scrutiny. Scholars analyzed handwriting pressure, phrasing, and tone. Some argued that the emotional language references to severe wind and prayer was unusual for formal record keeping. Others countered that maritime log style in 1900 was less rigid than modern documentation, allowing for personal observation. One subtle detail deserves attention. The handwriting in the final entry shows no sign of distress. There are no erratic strokes, no fragmented sentences. The script appears steady. This suggests that at least until the final entry was written, no immediate emergency was unfolding inside the tower. Okay. This steadiness reinforces the probability that the fatal event occurred after the last recorded note, likely during an outdoor task. Modern safety analysts have occasionally used the Flannan Isles disappearance as a case study in environmental risk management. Like, in isolated high-risk environments, layered safety procedures are essential. Today, workers in exposed maritime positions often operate with harnesses, redundant communication systems, and strict buddy protocols that require constant visual contact. In 1900, such systems were minimal or absent. The keepers relied on habit and experience. Another factor that may have influenced their decision-making is duty consciousness. Lighthouse keepers understood that damaged equipment at the landing could compromise future supply deliveries. If a mooring box or crane apparatus was at risk of being swept away entirely, securing it promptly would have seemed essential. Delay might have resulted in more severe logistical problems later. The urgency to protect infrastructure could have overridden caution regarding wave unpredictability. Though the geographical modeling conducted decades later revealed that certain wind directions combined with Atlantic swell could channel water directly toward the western landing at amplified angles. Even if the overall sea state was not categorized as a storm, local wave height at that specific impact zone could have been extreme. It is also worth noting that the men may not have been standing at the highest point of the landing when struck. The path descends in segments. A surge striking lower rocks could rebound upward along the incline, catching individuals from behind or below. When relief keeper Joseph Moore first entered the tower on December 26th, he described a stillness that felt unnatural. Yet objectively, that stillness was simply absence. The machinery was intact. The lamp was functional, the furniture undisturbed except for minor irregularity. The silence derived from vacancy, not violence. Silence has a particular psychological weight in remote locations. Lighthouses were built as symbols of continuity. When a lighthouse is empty, it feels incomplete even if structurally sound. Over time, the story of the vanished keepers intertwined with broader cultural fascinations surrounding maritime disappearances. The North Atlantic, with its history of shipwrecks and storms, carries an aura of unpredictability. The human mind often resists explanations that appear too ordinary for events that feel profound. Yet, ordinariness is precisely what defines this case. There is no evidence of sabotage, no sign of interpersonal conflict escalating to fatal consequence. No recorded sighting of unknown vessels in proximity. The geography itself limits plausible alternatives. Ilian Moor offers no hidden escape routes. The sea surrounding it is not forgiving. The fact that all three men vanished simultaneously amplifies perception of mystery. If only one had disappeared, the explanation might have felt straightforward, but three suggests sequence, reaction, chain, and that chain is likely measured in seconds. When automation arrived in 1971, ending the era of resident keepers at the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, it symbolically closed a chapter begun in 1899. Human presence was no longer required to maintain the beam. Technology absorbed the burden once carried by isolated individuals. The tower still stands against Atlantic wind, its white surface weathered but intact. Visitors who land today do so briefly and with awareness of safety guidelines shaped by decades of maritime learning. The names Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur remain recorded in lighthouse service rolls. Their disappearance did not alter the coastline or change ocean patterns. It did, however, underscore the vulnerability inherent in duty performed at environmental extreme. In investigative review, the most reasonable conclusion remains unchanged. A sudden and powerful wave, amplified by cliff geometry and unfortunate timing, swept 2 men from the western landing. The third, responding instinctively, followed. The sea offered no recovery. The lighthouse that went silent continues to operate, but its history carries a quiet lesson about the balance between routine and unpredictability. Human systems can prepare for known risks. They cannot eliminate every variable. On a December afternoon in 1900, 3 experienced keepers followed the logic of responsibility. Within moments, responsibility yielded to force. The tower remained. The light did not. And in the space between those 2 facts, the Atlantic closed over its final answer, Thor. By the time the 21st century arrived, the disappearance on Ilion Moor had been examined through nearly every rational framework available: meteorology, maritime safety, psychology, environmental physics. What remained was not confusion, but a narrowing of probability. The mystery endured not because the evidence pointed in multiple dramatic directions, but because it pointed in only one direction without leaving a witness behind. When modern researchers revisit the case, they often begin with geography. The Flannan Isles sit exposed in open Atlantic water, far removed from protective inlets or surrounding land masses that might soften incoming swell. The western side of Ilion Moor faces prevailing ocean energy directly. There is no buffer, no gradual slope to dissipate force. Waves strike rock, rebound, and climb. Computer modeling of wave behavior along similar cliff formations has demonstrated that under certain combinations of swell period and wind direction, vertical surge can exceed anticipated height by significant margins. This is not theoretical speculation. Offshore oil platforms in the North Atlantic have recorded rogue waves exceeding 20 meters in height, waves once dismissed as sailor folklore. In 1900, rogue waves were not scientifically recognized. They were anecdotal. A lighthouse keeper in that era would understand heavy seas, but not the mathematical anomaly of constructive wave interference. The men stationed at the Flannan Isles lighthouse operated within the limits of contemporary knowledge. Their risk assessments were based on experience, not on oceanographic modeling. Consider also the practical structure of their duty. The landing stage on the western side was not decorative, it was essential. Supplies were hoisted by crane from boats navigating below. If mooring ropes or equipment were damaged by storm conditions, failure to secure them promptly could jeopardize future resupply efforts. With winter underway, missed deliveries could create serious operational problems. It is plausible that Marshall and Ducat descended not recklessly, but responsibly. The question often asked is why all 3 men would be outside simultaneously, seemingly violating protocol. The answer likely lies in sequence, not intention. If 2 were working below and an abnormal wave struck, McArthur may have heard either impact or shout. The instinct to assist would override procedural caution. In high-risk professions, such instinct is common. Firefighters, sailors, miners. When colleagues are in danger, hesitation diminishes. The timeline therefore compresses. Initial descent to inspect damage, unexpected surge, immediate response, total loss within minutes. From inside the tower, there would be no time to relight the lamp or record additional entries. Darkness would fall regardless of human presence. Another element that contributes to the case's lingering resonance is the cultural symbolism of a lighthouse. A lighthouse represents warning, safety, vigilance. When its keepers disappear, the symbolism inverts. The protectors become the unprotected, yet the structure itself did not fail. The stone walls held firm. The lantern room remained intact. This distinction is critical. The disappearance was not due to structural collapse or internal malfunction. It occurred at the boundary between architecture and environment, at the exposed edge where human activity intersected with natural force. Over the decades, alternative theories occasionally resurfaced. Abduction bypassing vessel, mutiny, deliberate abandonment. Each fails under logistical scrutiny. No ship logs indicate proximity close enough to land unnoticed. The island's steep cliffs offer no covert departure route. No personal belongings were missing. There were no signs of struggle inside the living quarters. Even the frequently cited overturned chair may not indicate alarm. In confined living spaces, minor displacements are common. Its prominence in later retellings likely reflects narrative emphasis rather than forensic importance. The stop clock, similarly, is more poetic than probative. Mechanical clocks require winding. In the absence of maintenance, they stop. The emotional weight of the log entries remains perhaps the most debated detail. References to unprecedented wind, to prayer, to a colleague crying, these human notes have invited interpretation. But when viewed through the lens of isolation psychology, they lose sensational edge. Long periods of confinement and harsh conditions can amplify stress responses. The Outer Hebrides in December offer little daylight and relentless sound. Wind against stone can create vibrations that feel unnatural. It is not extraordinary that men under such strain would express anxiety or solemn reflection in writing. Importantly, the handwriting shows no panic. The entries are controlled, measured. This reinforces that whatever occurred did not unfold gradually inside the tower. It happened outside, abruptly. When automation replaced resident keepers in 1971, the operational risk profile changed permanently. Human vulnerability was removed from the most exposed position. The beam continued its rotation without fatigue or instinct. Today, vessels navigating those waters rely primarily on satellite systems, radar, and electronic charts. The lighthouse remains as redundancy and heritage. Its light still pierces darkness, but no one stands in its lantern room listening to the wind. The disappearance of Ducat, Marshall, and McArthur exists at a specific historical intersection. Before advanced forecasting, before modern safety harnesses, before remote monitoring. If the same swell pattern struck alien more now, sensors would record wave height. Cameras might capture impact. But there would be no keepers descending the rocks to secure equipment. In investigative assessment, the case stands as an example of environmental fatality compounded by timing and instinct. It does not require exotic explanation. Its power lies in restraint. 3 men carried out duty on a December day in 1900. Their final recorded words suggested routine conclusion. Somewhere between that entry and nightfall, the Atlantic shifted beyond expectation. No signal was sent. No witness survived. Only the absence of light revealed that something irreversible had occurred. The lighthouse that went silent remains one of maritime history's most disciplined mysteries. Not because it lacks explanation, but because its explanation is stark. Rock, water, human response. And a tower that continued standing long after the watch had ended. In the decades since the disappearance, the story of the 3 keepers has settled into a rare category of historical events that are both explained and unresolved at the same time. Explained in mechanism, unresolved in human finality. What distinguishes the Flannan Isles case is not the scale of loss. Maritime history contains tragedies involving hundreds of lives, but the compression of it. 3 men, 1 isolated station, a single afternoon, no witnesses, no remains, no final confirmation beyond probability. Modern investigative review often returns to the concept of a last known normal. In this case, the last known normal moment is preserved in ink. December 15th, routine entry, calm sea noted. That phrase, ZCOM, has generated debate for over a century. Some argue it contradicts the rogue wave theory. Others argue it strengthens it. Because calm seas can be deceptive. Oceanographers have documented that large swells can travel across relatively calm surface conditions. A horizon may appear stable while underlying energy remains in motion. Additionally, between major sets, there can be intervals of relative quiet. Mariners refer to these pauses as lulls. It is precisely during such lulls that individuals may venture closer to the water, believing the danger has subsided. If the keepers descended during what appeared to be improving conditions, the arrival of a delayed larger set would have caught them at their most exposed moment. There is also the topographical factor of rebound. When waves strike vertical cliffs, energy reflects outward. The collision of incoming and reflected energy can force water upward unpredictably. The western face of Ilion Moor is particularly susceptible to this effect due to its angular rock formations. In contemporary risk modeling, such zones would be categorized as high-impact interfaces, areas where standing near the edge during heavy swell is discouraged entirely. In 1900, operational necessity overrode theoretical caution. One overlooked dimension of the case involves sound. Witnesses who have visited the island during heavy swell describe low-frequency concussions as waves strike the rock base. These vibrations travel through stone, resonating inside the lighthouse structure. In darkness, such sounds can distort spatial awareness. A keeper inside might hear a particularly violent impact and interpret it as equipment failure or structural compromise. If McArthur heard such a concussion and did not immediately see his colleagues returning, the decision to investigate would have been instinctive. Instinct is efficient but unforgiving. Another aspect sometimes discussed is the possibility of sequential loss rather than simultaneous impact. It is conceivable that one man slipped independently on wet rock before any rogue wave occurred. If Marshall or Ducat lost footing while inspecting storm damage, the other might have attempted immediate rescue. In the struggle to assist, both could have been pulled toward the edge. McArthur, observing from above, might then have descended in response. In that scenario, the sea need not have delivered a single overwhelming surge. A combination of slick rock, steep gradient, and cold water could suffice. The Atlantic in December does not offer gradual immersion. Cold shock response can cause involuntary gasping within seconds. Muscular control declines rapidly. Without flotation or rapid assistance, survival time shortens drastically. It is also relevant that lighthouse keepers in 1900 did not wear modern buoyant safety gear. Heavy wool uniforms and leather boots would have absorbed water immediately, increasing weight and reducing mobility. From a forensic standpoint, the absence of bodies aligns with tidal patterns in that region. Strong currents west of the Outer Hebrides flow into deep Atlantic troughs. Once carried beyond immediate cliff proximity, recovery becomes improbable. The depth gradient offshore drops quickly, limiting the likelihood of resurfacing near the island. The investigation conducted by the Northern Lighthouse Board did not ignore these realities. Superintendent Muirhead's conclusion was grounded in observable physical damage at the western landing and the known dangers of exposed rockwork. What remains striking is the professionalism with which the matter was documented. There was no sensationalism in official correspondence. The language was measured, the tone factual. The event was categorized as tragic accident rather than unsolved enigma. And yet, outside administrative language, the psychological echo persisted. Part of that echo stems from the imagery of a prepared meal left untouched. Domestic routine interrupted suggests suddenness. It freezes time in a way that large-scale disasters do not. In major maritime catastrophes, chaos is evident. Here, order remained intact. This contrast between orderly interior and violent exterior intensifies perception of mystery, but it may also reflect the precise nature of the event. The crisis did not originate inside the lighthouse. It originated at its perimeter. Over the 20th century, lighthouse service gradually diminished as automation advanced. The era of isolated keepers faded. With it went a certain human intimacy with environmental risk. The Flannan Isles disappearance now belongs to a period when individuals physically confronted elements in ways that modern systems avoid. Today, meteorological satellites track storms across oceans in real time. Wave buoys measure swell height continuously. Hazard zones are mapped digitally. In 1900, observation relied on sight, sound, and experience. The disappearance of Ducat, Marshall, and McArthur can therefore be understood as a convergence of three factors: environmental amplification, operational necessity, and human instinct. None of these are extraordinary on their own. Combined at the wrong moment, they were fatal. There is a tendency in historical storytelling to seek hidden layers when an event lacks direct witness. But sometimes the simplest reconstruction remains the most credible. Three men performing maintenance on an exposed landing. An abnormal surge or slip. A reflexive attempt to assist. Total loss within minutes. The lighthouse, designed to guide others safely past danger, could not protect those standing at its edge. The beam failed to shine that night, not because of sabotage or supernatural interference, but because the men responsible for lighting it were no longer there. The crane, mooring ropes, and supply boxes were not secondary details. They were essential for survival during extended rotations. A damaged hoist system could delay resupply for weeks. This context matters. If storm activity on December 12th and 13th had indeed been intense at the island, even if not recorded as severe on the mainland, the keepers would have felt pressure to inspect and secure exposed fixtures once conditions appeared to moderate. They would not have considered that decision reckless. They would have considered it responsible. Now consider light timing. In mid-December at that latitude, sunset occurs shortly after 3:30 p.m. Twilight fades quickly. The lighting mechanism required preparation before darkness fully settled. If the men descended late in the afternoon to inspect the landing, they were working against diminishing daylight. Reduced visibility increases hazard perception errors. Wet rock surfaces can appear stable from certain angles. The depth and speed of incoming swell can be misjudged in fading light. There is also the psychological phenomenon of normalization of deviance. When individuals repeatedly encounter hazardous conditions without consequence, their tolerance for exposure increases. If the keepers had secured equipment during rough seas on prior occasions without incident, they may have perceived similar action as acceptable risk. This does not imply negligence. It reflects human pattern recognition under repetitive exposure. When evaluating the physical damage documented at the Western Landing, it is important to note that iron fixtures embedded in rock do not dislodge easily. For staples and fastenings to be torn free, repeated high-energy impacts likely occurred. That suggests sustained heavy swell rather than a single isolated splash. It is plausible that Marshall and Ducat descended while assessing damage caused by earlier wave strikes. If a final amplified surge arrived unexpectedly, it would have exploited already weakened anchoring points and destabilized footing. The third keeper's absence of oilskins remains one of the most telling details. In winter conditions on the Atlantic edge, no experienced seaman would voluntarily step outside without protective gear unless responding urgently. That detail supports the sequence of reaction rather than premeditated collective descent. Another dimension rarely discussed involves communication. There were no radio transmitters at the Lighthouse in 1900. Communication with the mainland occurred only through scheduled relief or passing vessels. In 1971, when the Lighthouse was automated, a chapter closed quietly. Automation did not commemorate the disappearance directly, but it symbolized a broader shift away from prolonged human exposure in isolated maritime stations. Technological redundancy replaced personal vigilance. Today, satellite imagery captures wave patterns across entire oceans. Predictive models forecast swell height days in advance. But even now, rogue waves are not entirely predictable at precise coordinates and times. They remain statistical anomalies, rare but real. The Flannan Isles disappearance, therefore, sits at the convergence of limited forecasting, manual maintenance, and instinctive response. There is no unresolved suspect, no hidden document withheld from public record. The mystery persists because no one witnessed the exact second of transition between routine and catastrophe. In the absence of witness, imagination fills space, but disciplined analysis narrows it again. 3 men likely descended to secure storm-damaged equipment. A sudden surge or sequence of surges overwhelmed position and footing. The third responded immediately. All were lost within minutes. The lamp remained unlit. The Atlantic absorbed the evidence. The lighthouse that went silent stands today not as a monument to supernatural speculation, but as a reminder of occupational exposure in an era before technological mitigation. It represents a boundary between control and environment, between preparedness and unpredictability. There are cases in investigative history where the unknown points toward hidden complexity. This is not one of them. Here, the unknown points toward speed. Speed of water, speed of instinct, speed of irreversible consequence. And when the water receded, the only thing left was a tower waiting for men who would not return.